Well, good morning, friends. And as it seems to always happen, the story I start to tell is always impacted by the 10 minutes or 15 minutes that we have prior to this time when I start the story. And today I just noticed in the script and in Robin's practice for spiritual grounding a couple of things about relationships and also about the whole purpose of our gathering, which is awakening leadership. And I wasn't necessarily thinking about awakening or woke when I wrote this story, but the process of awakening is essential. And I think there's this image of us kind of sleepwalking through various aspects of our life that's essential to the story that I'm about to tell. So just hearing those words and thinking about it changed the frame for me, even within the 10 minutes that we've been together so far. But as you know, I am an attorney. I'm near retirement. I've got a small solo general business practice, but much of my mid-career work was for a large law firm, and much of it involved infrastructure projects. So it involved clients that were building telecommunications and fiber optic projects, energy projects, including a wind farm and a proposed geothermal plant, both in Oregon. I actually worked on a pipeline project for the bad guys way back in the day. And I also worked on a massive distribution center in Hermiston. So these projects were mostly in rural parts of Oregon, with a couple of exceptions. But as a lawyer, and as you probably know from all your involvement in opposing fossil fuel projects, all these projects require numerous state, federal, and local permits. You can't build them unless you get all these legal permissions. You have to line them all up. You have to get them all approved. And you can't do much until you get all that stuff done. There's also, as I think you all know, process requirements. So these are under federal law for Oregon projects, but some states have their own procedural requirements. But they generally give what's called a notice and comment period to people who are affected by the proposed project. And for tribes, there's a particular separate requirement of what's called government to government notification, where the project developer reaches out to identified tribes that might be affected by a project and says, hey, we want to build this, and this could affect your interests and your lands. And so we're telling you about it, and we want you to comment and let us know if you think there's going to be any problems with this. All right. So to me, in my less awoke life, this all seemed fair and reasonable, right? There's a lot of process. There's opportunities to comment. There are laws that, as applied, can actually shape and even prevent a project, at least theoretically. I didn't have any experience where they did, and it's unusual, but it's possible. And so, you know, I went through that period of my career thinking this is all pretty good and fair. But fast forward to today, and many of you know about the climate cafes that Pastor Rashinda Fairhurst convenes via Zoom. I've been joining those for the last year or so pretty regularly. And her meeting format centers a guest speaker or speakers presenting on a topic that relates to the climate crisis, followed by Q&A and ideas for action. So not unlike our format in some ways. The two recent climate cafes that have contributed to my awakening both featured Indigenous speakers telling stories about infrastructure projects that they connected all the way back to the colonialism and white Christian supremacy embodied in the doctrine of discovery. As a very brief refresher, the doctrine of discovery is shorthand for a series of papal pronouncements in the 15th century in the so-called Age of Discovery. They provided the legal and religious authority for the agents of European monarchs to force Christianity on indigenous peoples under threat and to claim ownership of indigenous land for the church and the crowns they represented. Back to the climate cafes. One speaker was Toasty Oster, an independent journalist. Toasty has reported extensively on the Yakama Nation's response to the proposed Golden Dale Energy Storage Project near the John Day Dam. We've discussed that project in this space before, and I think we're all familiar with it. But as you recall, it basically involves the construction of two giant reservoirs, one at river level and one several hundred feet above on a bluff overlooking the Columbia Gorge. The two reservoirs would be connected by large pipes. When the wind is blowing and there's no market for the electricity generated by local wind farms, instead of shutting down turbines, the power would be diverted to this facility to pump water uphill from the lower reservoir to the upper reservoir. When the wind isn't blowing and demand for electricity exists, water from the upper reservoir would be released to the lower reservoir, passing through turbines to generate and supply electricity to the grid. All well and good, right? This is a really green and useful way to store wind energy. Unfortunately, as we all also know, the upper reservoir especially encroaches on the land that is sacred to the Yakima people. Tosi's investigative journalism unveiled the truth about the difference between what is legal and what is just, and the still present influence of the doctrine of discovery in today's laws. Under the law, the developer is presumed to have a legal right to build projects like this, including delegated governmental authority to condemn private property. The developer had 7 years to study and plan all aspects of this project before going public with it, to seek permits and to initiate the public notice and comment periods. While the law requires developers to identify potential impacts to tribal lands, as I've discussed, particularly to archaeological resources, the affected tribes have only 60 days to comment on the project once they are notified about it. 7 years versus 60 days. A business venture with access to tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars of capital, money to hire the best law firms and lawyers to make their case, money to spread around a community to build support for the project through advertising, political connections, the promise of jobs, economic development, and so on. Tribes with limited resources, perhaps no staff attorney or only a part-time cultural liaison or historic preservation officer. 60 days to assemble experts and resources needed to respond. It's not a just process, it's modern colonialism with a legal fig leaf. The other speaker was Sarah Augustine. Sarah is also Indigenous, a Mennonite, an author, activist, farmer, and rancher, a spouse and mother who coincidentally resides on Yakima land. Her book, The Land is Not Empty, Following Jesus in Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery, involves her decades-long story of advocacy for Indigenous tribes in Suriname, whose health and well-being is being compromised and threatened by gold mining on their traditional homelands. Sarah's story is especially troubling to me. The development in Suriname was structured through systems of international investment and finance, working within the Sustainable Development Framework of the United Nations in partnership with the government of Suriname. The main objective of these programs is to alleviate poverty. The Episcopal Church and many mainline churches strongly support sustainable development. Unfortunately, in this instance, gold mining is poisoning Indigenous people with mercury and driving them out of their homes. None of the Indigenous peoples have the skills to work in the mines either. In fact, most of the workers are skilled foreigners, not citizens of Suriname. To the extent poverty alleviation occurs, it's mostly on paper, an increase in Suriname's gross domestic product, not increased employment and higher wages for Suriname's unemployed and low-wage workers. Using mercury to extract gold in pristine environments and calling it sustainable development is bad enough, but it gets even worse. The United Nations has no legal standing to enforce its sustainable development policies or to set and enforce environmental standards. It's up to the host countries. Not knowing or fully understanding this, Sarah spent years on behalf of the tribes, futilely pursuing UN contacts and ministers, trying to find a top-down solution. Sarah was eventually able to broker a meeting directly between the tribes and local representatives of the project owner, and they did eventually agree to mitigate the mercury pollution. But it took years instead of months. I've reached a better understanding, or I've had an awakening, of how legal systems are not justice systems, how the doctrine of discovery continues to inform legal and other systems globally, and how today's legal systems perpetuate and continue historic injustice. It's both substantive and procedural. It's deeply embedded to the point where the average person wouldn't even think to question it. This is complex, but as urgent as the transition to a post-fossil fuel economy is, the faster we move within the systems we have, the more broken we'll become. When you hear the words permitting reform, know that this is code for moving fast and breaking things that cannot be fixed later, and that will apply equally to fossil fuel projects as well as to green infrastructure. A just process must involve systems change that centers the human rights of affected communities and that demands efficiency and simplicity over profit and growth. There are some mechanisms in place to improve these dynamics, such as the Just 40 initiative of the Biden administration, which we can and should support. However, these are still band-aids rather than preventative medicine. Thus, whenever we make comments on projects, whether we support or oppose them, we should know that the laws and regulations behind them are historically unjust and have been particularly unfair to Indigenous peoples, communities of color, and the poor. If these groups are for or against a project, we should center their stories. If these groups are getting steamrolled, we must dig into the process to understand why and how it is unfair, and then demand systems change. We can do better, we will do better, and we must do better. Thank you.
Turn off the recording. Thank you so much, Peter. Wow, just wow. What a story. I think we can go